The sledgehammer struck concrete at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, sending dust particles dancing through the amber construction lights beneath Dodger Stadium. Construction foreman Miguel Santos had been renovating dugouts for 43 years, but the sound his hammer made against the wall that morning was wrong hollow where it should have been solid, echoing where it should have been muffled. Behind him, the early morning Los Angeles traffic hummed along Stadium Way, oblivious to what lay hidden behind decades of concrete and silence. Detective Sarah Chen had been working cold cases for the Los Angeles Police Department for 8 years when the call came in at 9:15 a.m. The voice on the other end belonged to a trembling construction worker who claimed they'd found something in the old dugout walls that hadn't been there during the original construction. Chen's coffee grew cold as she listened to the man describe 13 children's baseball gloves arranged in careful formation, each one weathered and small, each one spelling out letters that formed words no child should ever have to communicate. 42 years earlier, on April 15, 1982, the West Side Warriors Little League team had disappeared without a trace during what should have been a routine celebration at Dodger Stadium. The team had won their regional championship the day before, earning them the privilege of watching batting practice from the field itself. 12 boys and 1 girl, ages 8 to 10, had vanished somewhere between the third base dugout and the team bus in the parking lot. Despite one of the largest missing persons investigations in LAPD history, no trace of the children had ever been found. The case had consumed Detective Frank Morrison's career and ultimately contributed to his early retirement in 1995, his health broken by 13 years of sleepless nights and false leads. Chen stood in the renovated dugout at 11:30 a.m., her breath visible in the cool morning air as she studied the gloves through the viewfinder of her camera. The leather was cracked and discolored, but each glove had been carefully positioned. When read from left to right, they spelled, "Help U.S. Coach did this." The words seemed to rise from the concrete like a ghost story made manifest, each letter formed by the careful placement of equipment that had once caught fly balls and scooped up grounders during Saturday morning games. The implications hit Chen like a physical blow. These weren't just random objects hidden in a wall. They were a message, a final desperate communication from children who had somehow managed to leave behind the only clue that would ever be found. The gloves had been sealed behind a false wall that appeared original to the stadium's construction, hidden in a space that would have required intimate knowledge of the building's layout and access to construction materials. Chen photographed each glove from multiple angles, documenting their exact positions before any evidence technician could disturb the scene. Officer Marcus Thompson, Chen's partner in the cold case unit, arrived at the stadium at 12:15 p.m. with the original case files in a cardboard box that had been stored in the LAPD archives for decades. The box contained hundreds of witness statements, photographs, and investigative reports that told the story of a community's worst nightmare. The West Side Warriors had been coached by 34-year-old Robert "Bobby" Kellerman, a beloved figure in the West Side Little League who had volunteered his time for 6 years and was known for his patient teaching methods and after-game ice cream traditions. Chen spread the original photographs across a folding table while Thompson read aloud from witness statements. The last confirmed sighting of the team had been at 2:47 p.m. on April 15, 1982, when stadium security guard James Moreau had seen them walking toward the third base dugout with Coach Kellerman leading the way. The children had been carrying their equipment bags and chattering excitedly about meeting some of the Dodgers players who were scheduled to sign autographs after practice. Moreau's statement, typed on faded paper, described the children as normal and happy, like any kids would be at the ballpark. The 1982 investigation had focused heavily on the possibility of abduction by strangers, with detectives interviewing dozens of stadium employees, vendors, and fans who had been present that day. Coach Kellerman had been questioned extensively, but never considered a serious suspect. His alibi had been solid. Multiple witnesses placed him in the dugout with the children until 2:50 p.m., and he had been seen frantically searching for the missing team members until well past 6 p.m. The coach had submitted to 2 polygraph examinations, both of which he had passed, and had cooperated fully with investigators until his death from a heart attack in 1994. Chen studied the crime scene photographs from 1982, comparing them to the current layout of the dugout. The original dugout had been smaller, with a different configuration of benches and storage areas. The false wall where the gloves had been hidden was located in what had been a storage alcove behind the bench area, a space that would have been easily accessible to someone with legitimate reason to be in the dugout. According to the construction records Thompson had pulled from the city archives, the dugout had been renovated in 1983, less than a year after the disappearances. The renovation work had been performed by Morrison Construction, a company owned by Frank Morrison's younger brother, Eddie Morrison. Chen felt the familiar chill that came with connecting dots in a cold case. Eddie Morrison had been interviewed during the original investigation because he had been working on various maintenance projects around the stadium during the 1982 season. His statement, buried in the thick file, indicated that he had been present at the stadium on April 15, 1982, performing routine electrical work in the dugout area. At 2:30 p.m., Chen called the number listed in Eddie Morrison's 1982 statement. The phone rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. Eddie Morrison, now 73 years old, still lived in the same house in Burbank that he had occupied 42 years earlier. When Chen identified herself and explained that she was reopening the West Side Warriors case, the silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "I wondered when someone would call," Morrison said finally. "I've been waiting for this call for 42 years. Chen arranged to meet Morrison at his home that evening, but first, she needed to understand more about the original investigation. She drove to the West Hills retirement community, where Frank Morrison, the lead detective from 1982, spent his afternoons playing chess in the recreation room. At 85 years old, Morrison's memory was sharp, and his eyes still held the haunted look of a man who had never found the answers he had spent his career seeking. "Those kids," Morrison said, his weathered hands folding and unfolding a napkin as they sat in the community room surrounded by artificial plants and the soft murmur of elderly residents. "I can still see their faces. 13 kids who just wanted to watch baseball and never made it home for dinner. Their parents still send me Christmas cards, you know. Still hoping I'll call with news." Morrison's recollection of the case was precise and painful. He described the frantic search that had begun within hours of the children's disappearance, with hundreds of volunteers combing every inch of Dodger Stadium and the surrounding area. The FBI had been called in after 48 hours, bringing cadaver dogs and specialized search equipment. The stadium had been shut down for a week, while investigators examined every possible hiding place, from storage rooms to electrical conduits to the vast network of tunnels beneath the structure. "We never found so much as a shoelace," Morrison said. "It was like they just evaporated into thin air. But I always had a feeling about that dugout. Something about the way it felt when I was in there. Like the walls were keeping secrets." Chen showed Morrison the photographs of the gloves, watching his face carefully as he studied each image. The old detective's hands began to tremble slightly as he recognized the significance of what had been found. "They were trying to tell us," Morrison whispered. "All these years they were trying to tell us, and we never heard them." At 6 p.m., Chen stood on the front porch of Eddie Morrison's modest ranch house, listening to the distant sound of traffic on the 101 freeway. The house showed signs of careful maintenance, fresh paint, trimmed hedges, a small garden with roses that had been recently watered. Morrison answered the door before Chen could knock, as if he had been watching for her arrival. The interior of the house was neat and sparse, with walls decorated with framed photographs of construction projects dating back to the 1960s. Morrison led Chen to a living room where 2 cups of coffee sat waiting on a coffee table made from reclaimed wood. The man who had once been a suspect in the disappearance of 13 children now looked like what he was. A retired contractor in his 70s who had spent decades carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "I need to show you something," Morrison said without preamble. He walked to a bookshelf and removed a photo album that looked like it had been handled thousands of times. Inside were photographs of construction projects, but interspersed among them were pictures of the West Side Warriors Little League team from the 1982 season. The children smiled out from the pages, frozen in time wearing their blue and white uniforms, their gloves dangling from their hands like the equipment that would eventually become their final message. "I took these pictures during the season," Morrison explained. "I was working on electrical upgrades at the stadium and I got to know the kids. They were good kids. Sweet kids. They deserved better than what happened to them." Chen studied the photographs, comparing the faces to the missing persons reports she had memorized. There was Jessica Martinez, the only girl on the team, grinning gap-toothed in her oversized uniform. Tommy Chen, no relation to the detective, held his glove up to the camera with pride. Marcus Johnson, the team's best pitcher, stood with his arm around Bobby Kellerman's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "Tell me what happened on April 15th, Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. Morrison's hands shook as he turned the pages of the album. "I was working late that day, trying to finish up some wiring in the dugout area. I saw the kids come in around 2:45, all excited about meeting the players. Coach Kellerman was with them, just like always. He was a good coach, you know. Really cared about those kids." The story Morrison told was one of terrible coincidence and split-second decisions that had haunted him for 4 decades. As he worked in the electrical chase beneath the dugout, he had heard the children's voices above him, chattering excitedly about autographs and ice cream. Then he had heard another voice, deeper, unfamiliar, speaking in urgent whispers. Morrison had climbed up from the electrical space to investigate and had witnessed something that changed the course of 13 young lives forever. "There was a man in the dugout with them," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not the coach. Someone else. Someone who shouldn't have been there. He was herding them toward the back of the dugout, toward the storage area." The kids looked confused, but they were following him because he was wearing a Dodgers uniform. He looked official. Chen felt her pulse quicken. "Did you recognize him?" "I'd seen him around the stadium before, but I didn't know his name. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair and a mustache. He had a badge or something that made him look like he belonged there. But something about the way he was moving, the way he was talking to the kids, it felt wrong." Morrison described how he had hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene in what might have been a legitimate stadium activity. In that moment of hesitation, the man had led the children through a door that Morrison had never seen opened before, into a section of the stadium that was supposed to be off-limits to everyone except maintenance personnel. By the time Morrison had climbed out of the electrical space and reached the door, it was locked, and the voices had disappeared. "I should have acted faster," Morrison said, tears forming in his eyes. "I should have stopped him right away, but I second-guessed myself. I thought maybe it was some kind of special tour or something. I was just an electrician. What did I know about stadium operations?" Chen leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. "What did you do then?" "I tried to find help. I ran to the security office, but it was empty. I tried to find other stadium employees, but it was between shifts and most people had gone home. By the time I found someone in authority, it was after 4 p.m. We went back to the dugout, but there was no sign of the kids or the man. The door I'd seen them go through was locked, and when we opened it, it just led to an empty storage room." Morrison's story explained why the children had never been found during the extensive search of the stadium. They had been taken to a part of the building that was not included in the original blueprints, a section that had been modified during construction but never properly documented. The man who had taken them had known about this space and had used it to hide the children while the search was conducted in other areas of the stadium. "I told the police everything," Morrison continued. "I described the man. I showed them the door. I gave them every detail I could remember. But without a body, without any physical evidence, they couldn't do anything. And then my brother Frank started asking me questions, and I realized how bad it looked that I had been there, that I had seen what happened but hadn't been able to stop it." Chen understood now why Eddie Morrison had never been considered a serious suspect in the original investigation. His brother Frank had been the lead detective, and family loyalty had created a blind spot in the investigation that had persisted for decades. Frank Morrison had believed his brother's account of events, but he had also been protective of Eddie's reputation and had not pushed for a more thorough investigation of his role in the case. "The renovation work you did the following year," Chen said. "You sealed up that storage area, didn't you?" Morrison nodded, his face crumpling with grief. "I found them when I came back to do the renovation work. All 13 of them in that hidden room. They had been there for almost a year, and I—" He stopped, unable to continue. Chen waited, understanding that this was the moment when 42 years of guilt and secrecy would finally be released. Morrison pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his eyes, then looked directly at her for the first time since she had arrived. They were arranged in a circle, he said, sitting against the walls like they were waiting for something. Their gloves were beside them, and someone had moved the gloves to spell out that message. I don't know if it was the kids who did it or if it was him, but those gloves were spelling out, "Help U.S. Coach did this." The revelation hit Chen like a physical blow. The children had been found, but their discovery had been concealed for 4 decades by a man who had been paralyzed by grief and guilt. Morrison's decision to hide the bodies had been driven by a combination of factors. His belief that his brother's career would be destroyed by the revelation that he had missed such a crucial piece of evidence, his own guilt over failing to prevent the tragedy, and his terror of being blamed for crimes he had not committed. "I couldn't let Frank find them like that," Morrison said. He was already destroying himself over the case, working 18-hour days, losing weight, barely sleeping. If he had found those kids and realized that I had seen what happened but hadn't been able to stop it, it would have killed him. And I was scared that people would think I was involved, that I had helped cover up the crime. Morrison described the agonizing process of moving the children's bodies to a more remote location, where they would eventually be found in a way that would not implicate him or damage his brother's career. He had spent months researching remote areas of the Angeles National Forest, looking for a location where the bodies would be discovered by hikers or rangers in a way that would appear natural. But as weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, the moment for revelation had passed, and Morrison had found himself trapped in a web of secrecy that grew more complex with each passing day. "I kept thinking I would find the right time to tell Frank," Morrison said, "but the longer I waited, the harder it became. And then Frank had his heart attack in '94, and I realized that the truth would probably kill him, so I decided to take it to my grave." Chen studied Morrison's face, seeing the toll that 4 decades of guilt had taken on the man. "But you kept the gloves," she said. "You preserved the message," Morrison nodded. "I couldn't destroy them. They were the only proof of what those kids had gone through, the only way they had to tell their story. I sealed them up in that wall, thinking that someday, when the dugout was renovated again, someone would find them and understand what had happened." The confession continued for another 2 hours, with Morrison providing details that only someone who had been present at the crime scene could have known. He described the condition of the children's bodies, the arrangement of their personal belongings, and the evidence that suggested they had been kept alive for several days before ultimately succumbing to dehydration and exposure. The hidden room had been soundproof and windowless, designed as a storage space for equipment, but converted by their captor into a prison from which there was no escape. "The man who took them," Chen said. "You never found out who he was?" Morrison shook his head. "I gave the police the best description I could, but there were hundreds of people who had access to Dodgers uniforms. Stadium employees, maintenance workers, vendors, even some volunteers. Without a name or any other identifying information, there was no way to narrow it down." At 9:30 p.m., Chen left Morrison's house with a signed confession and a promise that he would cooperate fully with the renewed investigation. The drive back to the police station gave her time to process the magnitude of what she had learned. The West Side Warriors case was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was a murder case with a known crime scene, physical evidence, and a witness who had concealed crucial information for 42 years. The following morning, Chen assembled a team of forensic specialists to begin the process of excavating the hidden room where the children had been found. The space was small, approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls and no ventilation. Luminol testing revealed extensive blood evidence, and cadaver dogs confirmed the presence of human remains despite the passage of 4 decades. Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the case, examined the hidden room with the methodical precision of someone who had spent her career translating the language of bones and decay. Her initial assessment confirmed Morrison's account. The children had been confined in the space for an extended period, possibly as long as a week, before ultimately dying from dehydration and exposure. The arrangement of the personal items suggests that the children were conscious and mobile for at least part of their confinement, Dr. Yamamoto explained as she documented the scene. The gloves were positioned deliberately, which indicates that the children were aware of their situation and were attempting to communicate with the outside world. Chen studied the photographs of the hidden room, trying to understand the psychology of both the victims and their captor. The children had been trapped in a space that was designed to be forgotten, hidden within the infrastructure of a building that represented joy and community for millions of people. Their captor had chosen a location that was both public and private, accessible to someone with the right knowledge, but invisible to the thousands of people who passed through the stadium every day. The investigation into the identity of the man who had taken the children focused on stadium employees who had been present on April 15, 1982, and who would have had access to both Dodgers uniforms and the hidden areas of the building. Chen and Thompson spent weeks interviewing former employees, many of whom were now in their 60s and 70s, trying to identify anyone who matched Morrison's description. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret Pellegrino, who had worked as a secretary in the stadium's administrative offices from 1980 to 1985, remembered a maintenance worker who had been fired shortly after the children's disappearance for what she described as inappropriate behavior with young visitors. The man's name was David Kessler, and he had been 26 years old in 1982, with dark hair and a mustache that matched Morrison's description. Kessler's employment records, retrieved from the stadium's archives, revealed a pattern of behavior that had raised concerns among his supervisors. He had been reprimanded multiple times for approaching children who were visiting the stadium, offering them unauthorized tours and access to restricted areas. His termination, dated April 23, 1982, cited, quote, violation of safety protocols and inappropriate conduct with minors as the reason for his dismissal. Chen tracked Kessler to a mobile home park in Riverside, where he had been living under an assumed name for the past 20 years. The man who answered the door was 68 years old, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes, but his facial structure matched the description Morrison had provided 4 decades earlier. When Chen identified herself as a police officer investigating the West Side Warriors case, Kessler's face went pale, and he immediately asked for a lawyer. The arrest of David Kessler on 13 counts of kidnapping and murder brought closure to one of Los Angeles' most infamous cold cases, but it also raised difficult questions about the failures of the original investigation and the consequences of concealing the truth for 4 decades. Eddie Morrison's confession had provided the key to solving the case, but his decision to hide the bodies had also deprived the victims' families of the opportunity to grieve and heal for most of their adult lives. Chen attended the press conference where Police Chief Rodriguez announced the resolution of the case, watching as the families of the 13 victims heard the truth about their children's fate for the first time. The parents, now in their 70s and 80s, had spent 42 years hoping for answers, and the revelation that their children had been found but concealed brought a complex mixture of relief and anger. Maria Martinez, Jessica's mother, spoke for the families when she addressed the media. "We are grateful to finally know what happened to our children," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But we are also angry that someone made the decision to keep this information from us for so long. We deserve to know the truth, and our children deserve to be found." The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the passage of time and the deaths of several key witnesses. Frank Morrison had died in 2018, never knowing that his brother had concealed the most important discovery of his career. Eddie Morrison, now 73 and in failing health, pleaded guilty to charges of obstruction of justice and received a suspended sentence in recognition of his cooperation with the investigation. David Kessler's trial began in October 2024, with Chen serving as the lead witness for the prosecution. The evidence against Kessler was circumstantial but compelling. His employment at the stadium, his history of inappropriate behavior with children, his termination shortly after the disappearances, and his decades of living under an assumed name. The defense argued that the passage of time had made it impossible to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. During the sentencing phase, Chen had the opportunity to read victim impact statements from the families of the 13 children. The parents described 4 decades of wondering, hoping, and grieving without resolution. They spoke of birthdays celebrated with empty chairs, of Christmas mornings when they still listened for footsteps that would never come, of the way the disappearance had torn apart their marriages and relationships with friends who didn't know how to offer comfort for such an incomprehensible loss. The impact of the case extended beyond the immediate families to the broader community that had been traumatized by the disappearances. The West Side Little League had disbanded in 1985, unable to recover from the loss of an entire team. Several parents of other players had struggled with post-traumatic stress, and at least 2 marriages had ended in divorce, as couples struggled to process their grief and guilt over their own children's survival. Chen found herself deeply affected by the case, experiencing nightmares and anxiety that required therapy to resolve. The image of 13 children arranging their gloves to spell out a final message haunted her dreams, and she found herself thinking about the moments of terror and hope that those children had experienced in their final days. The case had reminded her of the responsibility that came with being the voice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The resolution of the West Side Warriors case led to changes in LAPD procedures for handling missing persons cases, particularly those involving children. The department implemented new protocols for crime scene processing and evidence preservation, designed to prevent the kinds of oversights that had allowed crucial evidence to be missed during the original investigation. The case also became a teaching tool for law enforcement academies, illustrating the importance of thorough investigation and the dangers of making assumptions about witness credibility. On a warm afternoon in March 2025, exactly 1 year after the discovery of the gloves, Chen stood in the renovated dugout at Dodger Stadium, watching a new generation of Little League players take the field for their championship celebration. The space had been transformed into a memorial garden with 13 small plaques honoring the memory of the West Side Warriors. The gloves that had spelled out their final message were on display in a climate-controlled case, preserved as a testament to the courage of children who had refused to be forgotten. The families of the 13 victims had established a foundation in their children's memory, dedicated to supporting other families dealing with missing children cases. The foundation provided counseling services, legal assistance, and advocacy for legislative changes that would improve the investigation of child disappearances. Maria Martinez, now 82 years old, served as the foundation's president, channeling 4 decades of pain into a mission to prevent other families from enduring the same suffering. Chen remained in touch with Eddie Morrison, who had become an advocate for truth and reconciliation in cold cases. Despite his advanced age and failing health, Morrison had begun speaking to law enforcement groups about the importance of coming forward with information, even when that information might be personally damaging. His message was simple but powerful. The truth, no matter how painful, was always better than the torment of keeping secrets. The case had also inspired changes in stadium security and child protection protocols across Major League Baseball. All MLB facilities now required background checks for any employee, with access to areas where children might be present, and standardized procedures were implemented for monitoring and tracking youth groups during stadium visits. The changes came too late for the West Side Warriors, but they represented a commitment to preventing similar tragedies in the future. As Chen walked through the memorial garden, she reflected on the complex legacy of the case. The 13 children who had vanished in 1982 had finally been found. Their killer had been brought to justice, and their families had received the closure they had sought for 4 decades. But the case had also revealed the devastating consequences of well-intentioned but misguided decisions, the way guilt and shame could compound tragedy, and the importance of institutions and individuals taking responsibility for their failures. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the baseball field as Chen read the names on the 13 plaques: Jessica Martinez, Tommy Chen, Marcus Johnson, Bobby Rodriguez, Sarah Kim, Michael Thompson, David Wong, Lisa Anderson, Carlos Morales, Jennifer Lee, Anthony Davis, Kevin O'Brien, and Michelle Garcia. Each name represented a life cut short, a family destroyed, and a community's innocence lost. But they also represented the resilience of the human spirit, the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds, and the importance of never giving up the search for justice. The story of the West Side Warriors had begun with 13 children who wanted to watch baseball and had ended with a message of hope spelled out in worn leather gloves. Their final communication had taken 42 years to be heard, but it had ultimately brought peace to their families and justice for their deaths. In the end, the children had succeeded in telling their story, and their voices had finally been heard by a world that had never stopped listening for them. Chen left the stadium that day with a profound sense of completion and purpose. The case had been solved, the families had found peace, and the system had been changed to prevent future tragedies. But most importantly, 13 children who had been forgotten by the world had been remembered, honored, and given the justice they deserved. Their story would continue to inspire others to seek truth in the face of seemingly impossible odds, and their memory would live on in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by their courage and determination. The gloves that had spelled out their final message remained on display in the memorial garden, a permanent reminder of the power of hope and the importance of never giving up the search for truth. Visitors to the stadium would stop and read the story of the West Side Warriors, learning about 13 children who had faced unimaginable terror with courage and had found a way to speak to the world even in their darkest hour. Their message had been simple but profound. Help U.S. Coach did this. And finally, after 42 years, help had come.